It is a mentality that shuns excuses and focuses on what's at stake. A mindset that resolves within itself that you must totally empty yourself to experience victory. A memory that remembers that who and what you are playing for is bigger than you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fourth Quarter Christianity Podcast, a podcast where we utilize sports as a metaphor for life to convey spiritual truths and to help us with practical Christianity. I am so thankful that you guys decided to tune in to today's episode. We have a wonderful episode planned for you all today. My guest, Brandon Greene, and I talk about money. We know money is a valuable tool and can be used to bring about a lot of good in the world. But the unfortunate truth is many people don't know how to handle that valuable tool. And so I hope that you gain a lot of value from this episode as we embark on this journey that really never ends in the discussion of money. And please just leave a review after the episode. Leave a rating for the podcast, as this will help with the exposure of it. And we'll get right into the conversation with Brandon. Brandon, it is a privilege, man, to have you on the show. I've been looking forward to our conversation for over 2 weeks now. We got a little more acquainted with each other on Thursday of last week, and I'm just looking forward to our conversation here today. How are you?
I'm doing great, brother. How about you?
I'm doing great, man. We are getting some warmer weather. I told you before we started that we got hit with a blizzard on Sunday and received over 8 inches of snow. So the online world has been my home literally for the last 3 weeks. So we're hoping to get back in the building this Sunday.
Right.
How's the weather out there with you guys?
Well, it's sunny California out here, so hey, y'all can keep your blizzard over there. But no, the weather's been good. You know, we haven't really had much of a winter this year or last year, so
Yeah.
it's been surprisingly warm, and so we are definitely not looking forward to the summer this year.
Oh boy.
Because of how warm it's been in the winter. So yeah, but.
You know, that's interesting. How like what's the coldest temperatures you guys get over in that part of California?
It can get pretty cold out here. We're people forget that most of California is still a desert. So, so deserts get extremely cold or extremely warm. So, I would say on average, probably in the 30s and the 20s, we can get. There are some parts now, not to say that I know this podcast has nothing to do about climate change or anything like that. Even though I do believe that the earth does get warm, and their climate does, our climates do change.
Right.
But we know through the gospel, at least, how the world is going to come to an end. However, places that hardly ever got snow, like where I'm from, Las Vegas, is getting snow now.
I saw that.
So yeah, so climates are definitely changing out this way, so
well, maybe the preventive measures that they've included or implemented over the last few years to affect climate change to keep things from getting warmer quickly and from being warmer longer are starting to work, because I think Alabama got some snow this year. Alabama.
Wow. Yeah.
And so if Alabama, which is a toasty place, I mean,
it
come out, you go to Alabama, you one shade, and you leave, you're another shade. So I know that from experience.
I came back from, I think, Destin, Florida. This was while I was at school at seminary in Memphis, and Ron, our good friend Ron Sanders, who we always talk about, he remembers how dark I was. I was as dark as him.
Oh,
and
man,
and he still teased me about that, man.
No, Ron's a good dude. He's actually, he and I have our conversation after you and I. So
good.
Ron and I have our conversation on March the 9th, I believe.
Okay, good.
So I'm definitely looking forward to ours. So anyway, man, without further ado, we already got you to talking, so we want to get you to talking a little bit more. Go ahead and introduce yourself so that everyone can get a chance to know you better.
Well, I'm a native, like I said before, I'm a native of Las Vegas, Nevada. I'll be 30 years old this year, so
Hmm.
I'm about out of my 20s. So I envy y'all who are still in your 20s. Uh, but I've heard from a lot of sources that 30s is actually like the best time. So we'll see how that
Yeah.
works out.
They say 30 the new
Um,
20, huh?
right, yeah. So I originally my major in college was criminal justice. But I ended up leaving that major, and in 2012, I moved to Memphis, Tennessee, and attended the Memphis School of Preaching. I graduated there in 2014, moved to California, mainly because I met the love of my life in California. So it was just natural for me to move to a place that not only my love is in, but the place I always wanted to live anyway. You know, my
Absolutely.
family's from Southern Cali, so I know about that California life. So I've been out here ever since. I have been pretty much ministering for almost a decade now.
Okay.
I am with the Highland Church of Christ now here in Bakersfield, California, where we reside now. I'm the youth and family minister here. But my elders here were gracious enough to allow me to run my business here while I'm working alongside this great congregation.
Right.
I am right now a financial educator and coach, as well as a life and health insurance agent. I've been doing I started in the financial service industry as a life insurance agent, and then I basically just gradually switched, or well, not really switched, but um, just found other avenues of being in the financial service industry. I'm not big on sales. I'll just be honest with you. That's not the part that I love about my career. It's really educating people is what I love, and that may just be an extent of the fact that I love teaching the gospel. So I just naturally love teaching people about financial principles. And I'll just be straight up with all of you here who are listening. I didn't get into this business because I was some financial guru. I mean, you can talk to the Dave Ramseys and the Tony Robinsons. They can tell you all about that financial guru life, but that was not me. I was terrible with my finances. Matter of fact, I'm still um, recouping from the mistakes that I made in my early 20s. So yeah, I'm testifying right now. uh,
I can
but
relate, man.
yeah, so I didn't get into this business because I was great at finances. I was terrible. And it wasn't until the last 4 to 5 years that I actually started getting on track when it comes to my finances. I made a lot of really bad mistakes, and I'm paying for them still. And I'm still having to guard myself against some of those constant mistakes. So yeah, that's why I got into this. I wanted to basically be a voice um, of reason, a voice of challenging people, especially in the church, because this topic that we're going to be talking about is something that I think we try to avoid, even though it's a part of our daily life. Like you can't run away from the concept of money. So why run away from talking about it? Why, be ashamed of having that kind of conversation? I mean, I think we can have a healthy conversation about the subject of money without allowing money to be our God. So that's what I'm hoping that this podcast will do, or at least bring that kind of awareness. So
Absolutely. Obviously, this is a podcast about practical living for emerging adults, and what we try to do. One way to that we try to that I try to ensure that is by using sports as a metaphor to teach spiritual truths, and obviously to discuss the very prevalent issues that the emerging adults are facing in today's world. So as we just kind of look at the sports side of it, I think what everyone is dying to know, Brandon, how in the world did you become a Packers fan?
well, you know what? First of all, I'm from Las Vegas. We didn't have a team, right? The Raiders were not there. And even though the Raiders have moved into town, I don't care. Sorry, Raiders fans out there. I'm from Vegas and I do not care. Um, but yeah, we had no team. So one of my first games that I got to watch growing up was a Packer game. So and the fact that my last name is Greene. So
Ah,
so that had a little part to play. Yeah, exactly, right. So so I was definitely for the team before Aaron Rodgers. Okay, so I'm not a bandwagon person. When it comes to the Packers, I did follow Shaq in NBA. I did follow him. So I was a team, whatever team he was with. And I'll say this: the Lakers, though, when he and Kobe Bryant, God rest his soul, when him and Kobe Bryant were together, you had Derek Fisher, you had Fox. I mean, that was my dream team when it came to the NBA. And then after that, I just followed Shaq pretty much everywhere he went up until he retired. So, but yeah, so I do love sports, but unfortunately, well, I wouldn't say unfortunately. I mean, life is busy. Ever since I got into ministry, I haven't been able to pay attention to sports like I used to, growing up.
yeah,
But that's okay. I know where my priorities lie. But every once in a while, I get, especially with this year being COVID season, I definitely got a lot more time to watch my team
absolutely.
play. So great to see my Packers go pretty much almost all the way. We're still mourning out, Packer Nation, but
But
it's
that
all right.
man stepped
It's
in the
okay.
way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It happens, man. It happens. But I'm extremely proud of my team this year, So yeah,
Well, you see who this quote is by behind me, the late great Vince Lombardi.
of course. Of
So
course.
shout out to Packer Nation. Though I'm not
Mhm.
a Packer fan, I love that was a great coach. Even though I didn't have the privilege of
Yep.
watching him coach, I had the privilege of watching him on the classics that they show of football from back in the day, and
Yeah.
he looked and seemed to be a very knowledgeable man as far as the game goes, and also a great gentleman. So
Yeah.
our topic for tonight is trusting the process. This phrase was coined, at least I heard, from Alabama's superb coach, Nick Saban. He talks about this a lot in summer camp to the oncoming guys who are ready to play and suit up to play for the Crimson Tide. And he also talks about this in summer camp again to the guys who are returning. And his main theme, his ultimate goal for coining this phrase is for the guys to stay disciplined, for the team to remain in strive for their ultimate goal. One thing he always preaches and teaches to his players is discipline win ball games, and the lack of discipline will lose ball games. And so trusting the process in that sense, if you remain disciplined throughout a game, even though it's not going your way, don't get too excited, don't go for the long ball, don't jump off sides, things of that nature, that all of which can cause a team to lose a game. If they remain disciplined in that sense, then they will have a chance to be in a good position to win the game, in a good position to ultimately win the BCS championship. I think that relates closely to money. Money requires a lot of discipline. You alluded to the lack of discipline that you had in your early 20s, and that you're still sort of recuperating from that. I have fallen into that same predicament as a 23-year-old. I've made some dumb decisions financially. And I think we're not the only ones to have succumbed to some pretty bad financial decisions. But
Mhm.
what we want to do tonight is talk about that. We want to at least get the conversation started for the millennial generation today, and to make people feel more comfortable talking about their finances. Because again, as you stated before, we can't avoid it. So why not talk about it? So as we begin this particular episode, I want to start by asking this question. You made a distinction on Thursday, and I just want to make sure that everyone else knows the distinction of being a financial coach versus a financial advisor. And if you would, just go ahead and make that distinction before we get into the meat of the episode.
Right. So I can get into some serious trouble, if legal trouble, for saying that I am a financial advisor when that is a licensed profession. So it would be the same if I went around saying I was a doctor. I could have some serious legal problems. So a financial advisor, the main difference between a financial advisor and a financial coach is that a financial coach is more of a accountability partner. We're more educators than we are people who actually make those financial transactions when a client is ready to make them. Now, there are areas in which I can make those final financial decisions, such as in insurance, because I have a license for that. But I do not have a license to help you with your final financial decisions when it comes to investing. So that's what a financial advisor is for, or a certified financial planner. I can't even give you detailed tax advice. That's where a CPA would come in handy, because again, these are licensed professions. A financial coach is not necessarily a licensed profession. There are programs out there, and some which I have taken on myself, that do prepare us for the role of financial coaching. And matter of fact, in our industry, there may come a time where we will have a licensed um, uh, a license for that profession. But I'm more of an educator, and that's what I love about being a financial coach. So if you wanted to ask me, Brandon, what is the best investment vehicle out there? I couldn't tell you that legally. I could not tell you that. And really, to be honest with you, if there is any financial advisor that can tell you that answer, most likely they fibbing with you. Like that, there's so many different types of investing out there that it's all up to the individual's vision and direction that they want to go.
Right.
So that's really the main difference between a financial advisor and financial coach. And I have people call me a financial advisor all the time. I have to correct my clients all the time. Like, no, please don't call me that, because if you could get me in trouble if you use those terms with me. So
Right.
I want to make that disclaimer. But thank you.
Absolutely. So, different research institutions such as Pew Research, Gallup Poll, they
Mhm.
all take different aspects of looking at young people and the way they utilize their money and the way they perform on the jobs and things of that nature. So, according to those different research institutions, Generation Z, millennials, they don't hold jobs as long as people used to back in the day.
Mhm.
Back in the day, you hear people holding or working on a job for 20 plus years, and that seemed to be little. I mean, people get one job and then they retire at that job. But
Mhm.
now with our generation, it seems to be you get that job, you stay maybe 2 to 3, maybe 5 years. I think that was the most common amount of years that people stay at a job now in our generation, and
Mhm.
then they are ready to go and they're ready to make that extra dollar so fast. And so my first question is this: how has the effect of instant gratification, how has instant gratification affected the way emerging adults save their money?
That's a great question. So one of my favorite books that I recommend to a lot of people is how to deal with your finances when you have none. That's not the exact title of the book, but I'll probably give you that description later. But in that book, the author describes or quotes an economics professor, and that economics professor basically examined the fact that for many years we have still been our economy has been driven by consumerism. Like, we are a consumer driven economy. But the thing about it is our incomes haven't matched the cost of living that continues to rise up over the years, at least by 3% and sometimes more. So the question that the economics professor basically asked was, why is it that our economy is still doing well? How is it that we are still a consumer driven economy? People are spending money, but their incomes aren't matching what is being spent.
Mm,
It's because of our debt load. We are also a debt nation. We
mm,
live off of debt. We are trillions of dollars in debt, and we're rising as of this second. You can actually go online and actually look at what the debt rate is as it's going up, right?
mm.
So it gives us an indicator that we are people of instant gratification.
One thing I wanted to touch on that you actually mentioned that was interesting to me our generation are spending money they don't have. They don't have the money, but their their interest and their pursuit of things are more is heavier than ever, I believe, in my opinion. So I will use myself as an example. I have a credit card, okay? And if I don't necessarily have the funds to buy something, I would take out my credit card and I say, well, I can pay this off like a month from now, and that will give me the freeway that I need in order to pay off or in order to buy this particular item that I so desperately need. I can't wait
Mhm.
for it. I need it. And so I think that leads me to this next question. What do you think about credit cards? Are they good resource, bad resource? Should we even have credit cards?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, um, there's really two schools of thought and two men who are leading the thought when it comes to really the subject of debt in general. Credit cards, let's not get it twisted. Credit cards are small loans. So let's just call it
Mm,
what it is. It's a loan, right?
yep.
And so you have two schools of thought and two men that are leading the thought. You have Dave Ramsey on one hand, that's leading the thought that all debt is bad. There's no such thing as good debt, especially consumer debt, which is credit card debt.
Right.
But then you have Robert Kiyosaki on the other hand, and he believes that you should be able to use debt responsibly in order to move ahead in life, especially when it comes to business. So you have these two different sides when it comes to this idea of debt and the usage of debt. Now, I'll just give you my ultimate opinion on it. I think that credit cards have their place, but here's the thing: if you don't know how to use it, then it will run you.
Right.
And it goes back to the issue that's actually a biblical foundational principle that we find in scripture in Proverbs 22 in verse number 7. The slave is the slave, or excuse me, the borrower is slave to the lender.
Right.
That is a principle that is a biblical principle that we find. And that's one of the principles that Dave Ramsey often uses. He always goes
Mhm.
back to that
Exactly.
passage. And I find it very interesting, just to backpack that passage for a moment. I've always found it interesting who the writer of Proverbs, being Solomon, King Solomon, who he was writing to. You hear the language of my son, listen to the wisdom of your mother. So I don't think that Solomon is writing solely to all of Israel. I think it's more he's writing to his own children. And we also know who the next king is going to be, which is Rehoboam, his own son. So most likely that's who he's communicating to. So if you look at the passages before verse 7, which, by the way, if you're going to study scripture, including wisdom literature, oftentimes we sort of use passages almost like one-liners,
Right.
and we think that that's the context is only within that passage, and therefore I can just take that and run with it. I think you're doing yourself a disservice if you just look at even wisdom literature that way. There's a context even to wisdom literature. And part of this is speculation. I can't necessarily 100% prove this, but I think it's just interesting that when you look from verses 1 through 6, you get this idea of who is a person who connects themselves to the wisdom of God. And you get this idea of the fact that a person who connects themselves to the wisdom of God, if they're rich, they do well to those who are lower than them economically. They take care of all because everyone is a child of God. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, right? So you almost get this sense, especially at the beginning of verse 7. Basically, what he says is the rich rule over the poor. Now,
Right.
if Solomon is writing this letter to his soon-to-be heir of Israel, Rehoboam, and he's king, then guess which side he fits? He fits the rich side, right?
Exactly.
He's the person in which he's talking about. The rich rule over the poor. That's you, Rehoboam. That's you. And so I think that the bottom of verse 7, the lender is slave, or excuse me, the borrower is slave to the lender. I think it's a warning. I think it's a warning in three ways. I think one, he's warning any future heir of Israel to not have a slave society. Like, you're going to have to rule over these people. Don't create a slave society, right? A debt society. Two, I think he's warning him also that Israel better not become slaves to other nations, right? Because of their borrowing and trading and getting into this debt mentality with other nations. And by the way, Israel had a lot of trouble when they partnered with nations that God told them not to partner with, and a lot of it was over economics.
True.
Which we still, even in our own country today, and countries all around the world, we still have problems with, right?
Right.
So yeah, that's the second thing. And then the third thing, I think, is when we can put an individual application on it of making sure that we understand the principle. If we borrow money, we will be a slave, right?
Right.
It's not the same type of slavery that we are used to in our country's history. It's a Greek and Roman type of mentality of slavery, where you would basically end up voluntarily becoming a servant of your debtors in order to pay off your debts. That's the type of slavery he's talking about. And we still have it today. We may not be, if we owe Bank of America, we may not all become bank tellers in order to pay our debts off, but we're working for somebody so we can pay that debt off. So we're still a slave to Bank of America. If we owe them debt, we're still a slave to whatever lender we have. And so I don't think that Solomon is necessarily saying it's a sin to borrow money, but there is a reality when you borrow money. And you have a responsibility when you borrow money to pay back your debtors.
Right.
But I also think this too, and I do think that there is a sense of, as Christians, when it comes to the lending side of things, I think there is an emphasis in Scripture that if we have people who borrow money from us, then I think we have a responsibility to basically forgive that debt. Even Jesus himself would say, forgive us of our debts as we have forgiven others. I don't think that's just a spiritual application of God forgiving our sins. I think there is a physical application to that as well. But here's the thing: the world isn't so forgiving.
Nope.
So if you're going to use a credit card, understand how it works. Understand how it works. You got to pay it off a week before the end of the month. If you don't, every time you fail to do so, every month, interest is always tacked on the entirety of your balance, not just on that one item that you bought. On your entire balance is the interest that's going to accumulate. So you got to know that. And also just understand that if with credit cards, the interest rates are extremely high, with the average interest rate of being about 25%. So if you've only put $100 onto that credit card and you're charged at 25%, that's $125 that you owe the bank if you don't pay it off by the end of the month. And just so we understand, the minimum payment, that's designed for you to continue to be in slavery. Yep. This is not a conspiracy. This is a reality. You will continue to, I've heard it said this way: if you owe $10,000 on a 25% interest rate, you are probably going to end up paying, it's going to take you about probably 20 to 25 years just to pay it off if you continue to pay on the minimum balance. That's ludicrous. That's ludicrous.
Absolutely.
It should not take you that long to pay off $10,000. But if you stick to the bank's plan, that's exactly what's going to happen. It's going to take you years to pay what people would consider a little debt off. And that's unfortunate. But so you got to know how to use those. But if you can't use them correctly, then just don't. Just don't. I'm sure one of the questions you're well, I'll just let you continue to ask them, but I just thought about this. one of the things that people don't realize when it comes to credit is that all a credit score, all that is basically a measurement of telling other lenders that you pay your credits on time. That's all it is. That's all a credit score is. Um, so so even if you have a really hard time with credit, it's okay if you don't have the greatest credit score, because it can destroy you if you let it. If you don't know how to use it correctly, it can destroy you. So be careful. Be
So
careful.
it's interesting that you brought up credit, and yeah, that's something that we're going to get into, and we can get into it right now. Actually,
Mm.
one of the questions that I know that I've had for a long time, and many other in my generation have, is if credit cards are bad and we don't supposed to have credit cards, then how can I even work on my credit? How can I begin to improve my credit? And if my credit is shot already, how can I even start from that? Or what position am I to start from? Where do I need to start in order to build or change my credit towards a better direction? And you mentioned Robert Kiyosaki and Dave Ramsey, two guys who are rich. They're from two different schools of thought. So I would even argue that whether you go the credit card route or not, you still have a chance to be rich. You still have a chance to utilize or to save a bunch of money and to be well off in that sense. And so just going back to the idea of credit, how how do you begin to work on your credit? How do you begin to improve your credit, especially if you've already done a lot of damage to it?
So there's a simple way of doing that, at least in my estimate, and a lot of financial professionals teach this route. Um, when you have a really bad credit score, obviously lenders are not going to just voluntarily give you amounts of loans to borrow from, right? You're a risk
Right.
because your credit score indicates that you don't pay your credits on time. So um, building your credit, one simple way of doing that is just by taking um, small amount credit cards, which usually banks will give you for about 200. You'll probably get a credit limit of about $200. And they're usually low interest rates, and sometimes high, depending on how bad your credit score is. But if you would just basically put bills on your credit card instead of, I mean, these are things that you're already going to pay for.
Right.
Okay. You already know that you're going to pay for your bills. You already know that they're going to be coming every month. So it's something that you know that you're going to have the money for, because that's why you're, working and doing that. Um, so if you just put, a few of your bills onto that credit card, as many bills as you can, and then again, pay it off at the end of the month. That's a good way to build your credit. That's a really fast way to build your credit. Now, there may be different avenues depending on your situation, but to me, that's probably one of the best ways to do it. Um, Credit is, again, it's a interesting beast, because again, you have these two different views,
Right.
where credit is bad. Like, you just shouldn't have it, including home loans and mortgages and student loans. Like, it's just bad. You shouldn't touch it. But then the question then remains, well, then how can I get a house if I don't have any credit? How can I get a degree if I don't have any credit? And there's ways. I'm no expert in this, so I don't know all the ways to do this. I know Dave Ramsey shares a lot of different advice when it comes to how you can get a home without, having credit. And there are mortgage companies out there that do not do mortgages, that will help you somehow be able to take your hard-earned cash and basically convert it into a home. So there's
Oh,
avenues out there, but I'm not that familiar with it. But the traditional route, I think there's a way of doing it without getting into a lot of debt. You got to do your research. You got to look in to different banks and what they offer. Banks are usually the best place to get the loans because the interest rates are extremely low, especially credit unions. So there's avenues and ways to do it. Um, but just be careful. Just be
right.
careful with that.
So I know with me, when I purchased, or not purchased, but when I received my first credit card, I first went the secure credit card route. So I
Mhm.
got a credit card through my bank, and I had to put my own money on the credit card in order to spend my own money, essentially.
Mhm.
So one thing that I learned the hard way was don't spend more than you have in your bank account. Okay.
Mhm.
Always spend the amount that you have in your bank account. And that way you know that you can pay it off. And you
Mhm.
alluded to something that I thought was fantastic. If you put your bills on your credit card, you know that you have to pay your bills. You know that you're going to pay your bills. So the money should already be set aside to pay your bills. And that way, if you put it on your credit card, you can pay that off. And then that obviously would in turn improve your credit score overall. And so I think that's some very practical advice that we can take and utilize. And another thing, we could put gas. I know that I put gas in my car, and I use my credit card to buy the gas. And in turn, I pay that off because I'm already expecting to put gas in my car. So I
Right.
think that's practical advice that we can implement in our lives now for sure, that will help with our credit score. But the next thing I want to get into, as far as the discussion of money, we obviously, you and I share a common faith. We're Christians, and one thing that I think we must consider as Christians is, where does money rank in our lives, right?
Mm.
We can't, it's an unavoidable subject, in my opinion. I know you think the same. We can't get around money. We know that it is a tool, but the Bible has a lot to say about money. And so, and from your study, how does God define the purpose of money in the life of the Christian?
So, I just recently taught this to our youth here at Highland. But oftentimes, um, what ends up uh, what ends up happening is that we there's two questions that we have to ask when it comes to this discussion. Is, first of all, who is truly the giver of money? And then based on that answer, we then know, if we understand who truly is the giver of money, then they have the right to then tell us what the purpose is.
Hmm.
So if you were to go to Deuteronomy chapter 8, and if you were to look at verses 11 through 20, you will see that it is God that is the giver of wealth. When Israel is going basically through its second chance act, where God had basically destroyed an entire generation of his people for the sins that they continue to commit. And they were saying things, and Moses actually records this in his sermon. They were saying things like, we're the ones that got ourselves out of Egypt. We're the ones that are able to survive in this wilderness years. We're the ones that are creating this atmosphere of wealth and just goodness that's happening in our lives. And Moses is like, it's it was God the entire time. God was the one that got you out of Egypt, out of slavery. God is the one that got you through the wilderness years, those 40 years. God is the one that has created, your food, your health, all of those things, right? So in I believe verse number 20, if I'm not mistaken, in that verse, he says, God is the one that provides that wealth. God is the one that does that. So if the answer there is God is the one that is the giver of wealth, then he has the right to then tell us what it's used for. So then you go to Proverbs chapter 3, and in verses 1 through 10, and then you find out that in there is the purpose of money. What's the purpose? To honor God with our wealth. That is the purpose of money. So God is the provider of wealth, then he gives the purpose, which is to honor God with our money. Now, there's a very practical application, if you would, that I don't think is discussed often from Matthew chapter 25. There's a parable there of the five 2 and 1 talent men, right? And I think most of us, especially if you were raised in the church or been in the church long enough, you know this parable, right? You've heard many sermons on this parable. But there's an interesting phrase at the beginning of this parable when the master then gives his items over to these men. And that word is he entrusted them with his possessions. Entrusted. Well, what do we mean by entrusted? There is an atmosphere of responsibility within that word. He is basically giving you his material, his possessions, that you will do right by him with those things. And in this case, which they were supposed to do make a financial decision, they were supposed to basically invest that money in order to accumulate more. Right. So the 5 talent man invests, he gets 5 talents more. A 2 talent man does the same thing, he gets 2 talents more. So they were to invest that money. That was their part of their responsibility. But the 1 talent man, he buries it. Right. And we know his excuse for why he does it. He tells the master, one, you're a hard taskmaster. You're asking me to do something that I'm just not capable of doing. You basically can make money come out of thin air. Everything you touch is gold. You're Warren Buffett, right?
Right.
So there's no way. So I was afraid and I buried your talent, right? And so what did the master do? He took the talent away from him, right?
Right.
And threw him, and he kicked him out of the house. Kicked him out of the house. Like, you have no right to be here anymore. I can't trust you with my possessions. And get this, these men, or at least in this parable, they would have been living within the home of this master, which means that they would reap the benefits of the very items that they've been entrusted with. So they get to, they get to chill at the pool, right? They are a lot like Jeffrey in Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Jeffrey got to live in the house as a butler. He got to eat the food that the master got to eat, right? So there's so many benefits when you get to live inside the house. So that tells me that this idea of God is the giver of wealth, and it's all his possessions in the first place, and he tells us what to do with that wealth. We get the benefits of having it and using it. But the question we always have to ask ourselves is, are we truly honoring God with it? Everything that we have belongs to him. Our Mac computers belong to him. Our toothbrushes belong to him. I mean, you name it, everything that you have belongs to him. So yes, the question is, how am I honoring God with my wealth, with his possessions? Because they all belong to him anyway. And so that's the challenge that we have to, discover and look towards. And it's not a question that I don't think is asked often. When we, I mean, when's the last time you heard somebody say, I'm getting this career change, or I'm getting this promotion in order to, um, in order to give God more honor and glory?
Don't hear it often.
No. Matter of fact, it's usually so I can make more pay, so I can feed, or I can get a bigger home, so I can upgrade my things, so I can retire early, right? So there's all of these reasons, and they're not necessarily bad reasons, but
Right.
the overall arching theme should be, how can I honor God more with the wealth that he's given me?
That's interesting that you brought that up with as far as the promotion and people wanting that higher paying job or position in order to do more with their stuff that they already have or to acquire more stuff. It reminds me of Luke 12:13, the rich fool. And I think Jesus was given the parable. Pair of two brothers was one brother was having a dispute, or two brothers were having a dispute with each other, and one came to the master and essentially said, tell my brothers to divide the wealth with me.
Mhm.
And Jesus went into this parable, and he told the parable about this rich fool who, when his barn was filled with all of the produce that he had made from that year. He built a bigger barn in order to store more stuff. And you alluded to this idea of people not wanting the position to glorify God, who is the giver of all things. I think James chapter 1, I believe verse 17 through 18 talks about all good and perfect gifts come from the Father above. And so when we think about all good things and money and things of that nature coming from God, then it puts it in perspective for us. Money doesn't rank higher than God, which is Matthew chapter 6, verses 26 and following.
Right.
We can't both serve God and money. And so then money has a place and it must remain in its place. But I guess the ultimate question, at least that comes to my mind, is this: how we're supposed to glorify God with our money. I agree with that. But how? Right? Like what are some things I can do with my money that will glorify God? I mean, we get the theological perspective, but what's the practical part of that? How do I glorify God with my money?
Wow. There's a lot of angles that you can go with that. I guess one example of this would be, well, for starters, just I may be saying something a little personal here, but it drives the point. Cynthia and I, my wife, one of our goals is to eventually own our own home, and we want to be able to pay that home off in a reasonable amount of time. And we are enrolled in programs to do so. But one of the things that we're desiring as far as a home is not necessarily all the bedrooms in the world, which it would be nice to have many bedrooms for different things. But one of the things that we're hoping to have is a big enough living area to where we can have members of the church over for just all sorts of different things. Whether it be just times for us to just fellowship and eat together, for studies, right? We want to be able to invite people who are outside of the body of Christ to be influenced by members of the body. And so there's so many things that you can do, but that's really the question, right? So I have to really look at my reasoning behind why I want this. Right. So it doesn't become, I think James 4 is probably a great example of this, where James talks about the fact that there are people who will go to such and such a town and, will say, we're going to do, this financial decision, and we're going to buy this product, and we're going to do this kind of business. But they don't consider at all, God is not the priority in their mindset. So instead of us saying we're just going to go and do this, we really should be asking the question, well, if God allows, right? If God, are we honoring him in this decision making? Are we putting God in the forefront of our minds when we are deciding to do this or to do that? Because as James points out, if you don't, that's sin.
Right.
When you don't consider God and your position with God in your decision making, that's sin.
Right.
But oftentimes that's exactly what we do. We take God out of the plans when he needs to be the biggest part of the plan, no matter what decision it is. So it's okay to have wants and desires, but God needs to be the biggest reason behind those wants and desires. Am I glorifying God with those wants and desires?
Right. You made me think about an illustration that I heard quite some time ago from a Christian apologist. And he stated that one guy that he was talking to alluded to his faith as in comparison to others, to the faith of others. He said you can compare them with two circles, and within those circles are two dots. He said the problem with most people is that their faith represents the dot, and their lives represents the circle. He said my faith represents the circle, and my life represents the dot. He said, why is that? Because my faith encompasses my life. And so if my faith encompasses my life, that means that my faith governs my life. And going back to what you said about finances, if God is first in my life, like as Christ stated in Philippians chapter 1, Galatians 2:20, to live is Christ, then Christ is my life. That's it. And so then I'm going, everything that he's spoken, everything that is written, all the words that he spoke that is written down for us in the New Testament, I'm going to live by. And part of that he talks about is money. James being his brother, I would like to believe, I believe that he did take that idea, that principle from Jesus, Matthew 6:19-21, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven,
Mhm.
not on the earth, because moth, rust, thieves break in and steal. That stuff decays. And
Sure.
when you die, who is it going to belong to? Solomon talks about that in the
Right.
book of Ecclesiastes. Right?
Yep.
Who is it
The
going to
highest
belong to?
bidder.
You're not going to have, and I know you heard the old adage before, there has never been a hearse, there has never been a U-Haul to follow behind a hearse, right?
That's right.
All your stuff is going to be here for the next man.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
And I just think, to me, at least, that helps me to put it into perspective. And another thing that you said that I thought was great, you and your wife, you want that house, that bigger space, not just for the comfort of your family, but for the comfort of your physical family, but for the comfort of your spiritual family. You
Mhm.
want to be able to invite members of the church over, to do fellowship, devos, to have a great time with them and have that space to accompany them and make them feel comfortable. And I think that's a way that we can utilize our money to glorify God.
Mhm.
Another way that my wife and I have been trying to utilize our money to glorify God is that when we get paid, here's what I tried to do. We haven't been consistent, which we need to be more consistent. But we decided to, when we get paid, go out. If we see somebody at the gas station and they're going into the store, or if we know that a person behind us is needing gas, we'll just tell the sales clerk, hey, listen, we're going to pay for their gas. Whatever they need, if they need a full tank, whatever, we're going to pay for it. And majority of the time we tell them, don't even tell the person who's paying for their gas. Because ultimately
Mhm.
kindness, in my opinion, isn't for show. Right. I'm
Right.
not
Amen.
trying to
Amen.
show the world that I'm so kind and
Yep. Mhm.
that I'm doing this for the glory of God. Well, I am doing it for the glory of God, but God who sees in secret blesses thee openly. And so that's how I want to try to live, especially when it comes to finances. Obviously, you can support different children homes that are trying to provide better living situations for children. My
Yep.
wife works at Children's Hospital. They're receiving
Mhm.
donations all the time. I know we have a
Yep.
lot of brotherhood works within the
Mhm.
church that are receiving donations. Gospel Broadcasting Network, Apologetics Press, FocusPress.org. I mean, we have so many that we can give to, and I believe that will ultimately be showing our glorifying God with our money. But when
Mhm.
thinking about that idea of giving, one thing I know that has just truly baffled my mind and
Mhm.
my wife's mind, and probably so many other minds of people that are listening, when it comes to giving within the worship assembly,
Mhm.
how do you know how much to give, and what would be your advice to stay consistent with that number?
That is I mean, that's a very controversial area, because we don't have a scripture necessarily in the New Testament that says this is how much you are to give every week. We don't have that. All we have is the Jewish principle,
Mm.
which would have been 10%. That's the tithing that they would have done. But the thing about that is that they gave way more than just 10%. There
Mm.
were other avenues that they were supposed to give, other times out of the year that they were supposed to give. So it was way more than just 10%. But that's what we tend to focus on, right? And
Right.
I'm sure people who have backgrounds in other religious groups probably have been told that, right? You give 10%. But that's the beauty of the New Testament is that it's no longer God giving a strict amount to give. It is now it give the New Testament, the blood of Christ now gives us the ability to do things based on our heart, based on how, based on our relationship to God, rather than God demanding a certain portion before you. Now, there are
Right.
times in which God does demand, he's very specific about that demand. But in this case, we don't have a scripture. All we have is that we should not be giving grudgingly, and that
Right.
we have a responsibility to take care not only of our own but even our community. So there's no set giving, but here's the principle that I've always heard, and I think is so true. if if you're giving, right? If you are okay, let's just be honest, right?
Right.
If you're okay with paying ridiculous amounts of money for all sorts of different activities every month, and doing all of these, great things, that because right, because of how COVID has been, I mean, we miss some of those things that we used to be able to do freely, right?
Right.
But you're willing to pay all of those, but yet you're not, but you rather just give God a tip.
Mm.
Like, there's a problem, right? There's a heart issue there. Like, look, I'm not saying that you know that your monthly I'm not saying that your mortgage payment should necessarily match what you give. I'm not saying that at all.
Right.
But what I am saying is that it should give you an indication of, hey, I know that I'm able to give this amount based on how my bills are set up. And I think one of the biggest reasons why people have a tough time giving is not because they don't have the means, but because they have poor financial planning. They
Mm.
don't plan, they have no budget, they have no vision spending plan. So it becomes very easy to rob Peter to pay Paul, right? It becomes very easy to one of the first things that usually goes when people are in a struggle when it comes to their finances is the giving. It's the easiest one to start to take from, right? So again, there's no set amount. However, I think there's a principle from the Jewish principle that we can learn that, and again, everything belongs to him anyway. So even if you don't put in the collection plate, it doesn't make it magical all of a sudden that
Right.
now it belongs to God. No, everything belongs to God anyway. So you should be asking yourselves, how can I give of the things that I have, my time, my cell phone? How can I use those things to glorify him even beyond the collection plate,
Right.
so I think those are things that, again, I wish I had a thus saith the Lord statement that I can say, yeah, I know exactly how much to give, but we don't have that. But I think the principle is we should be people who are givers,
Right.
people who are willing to give everything over to God. Maybe not in the sense of putting everything in the collection plate, but actually asking the question, how can I give honor and glory to him with all the possessions that I have?
Absolutely. And I think regarding that particular question that you just asked, I think the church in Jerusalem, if I'm not mistaken, was in a bad situation, and the church in Macedonia actually helped them out. That
Yep.
church that was full of Gentiles that we read about, I think in First Corinthians chapter 8, I
Mm-hmm.
believe,
Mm-hmm.
they put together their possessions, their money, and sent to their brothers and sisters who probably didn't hold them in a favorable light because they were mostly Jewish, but
Mm-hmm.
they sent their money and different possessions to that congregation to help them out. And there you read of Paul's admonition in First Corinthians 16, chapter 1, or verse 1 through 2. I think we often use that as the scripture to sort of solidify why we give on the first day of the week. And if we
Mm-hmm.
look at their example, we can see that they gave primarily with the perspective of love hanging over in the balance. Like, I
Yep.
love my brothers and sisters. We may not see eye to eye on every particular issue or situation. They may not even like me necessarily. But
Mm-hmm.
because I know that what I have ultimately belongs to God, I'm going to give to them anyway. And in my perspective, I think that's why Solomon focused. He did focus a little bit more on the temple of God.
Mm-hmm.
He built this palace, of course, which was I hear it was a marvelous, wonderful palace.
Yeah. All right.
But then again, he turned around and overlaid the vessels within the temple with gold. Right. I mean, he
Right.
really just took time to spruce up, if you will, the temple of God. And one quote, and I want to get into the idea of I want to get into the idea of a financial plan before we close. But one quote that I heard last week, to be exact, was by Mark Batterson, and he stated this. He said, "When God blesses you financially, don't raise your standard of living, raise your standard of giving." I think that's
Mm-hmm.
phenomenal. We must be a people of giving, right? And so when
Right.
when God does bless us financially, don't think like the rich fool.
Right.
He was blessed with those material gains, and that he had a great return in his crops that year. And
Right.
so he was like, oh, let me tear down this barn, build a bigger one, and just store the stuff. Why are you storing it? There are some people, there are some Lazarus out there that need food, but you're not thinking about them, right? You're thinking about how much stuff I can accumulate and keep for myself. And don't get me wrong, I'm guilty of that. Hey man, I'm a sneaker head. I love sneakers. I'm being honest. I love sneakers. And when you were talking about, you go out and spend X amount of dollars to have fun or to do some recreational activity, and my recreational activity most of the times is shopping. Man, I love the nicer things. I don't buy Jordans often, but I buy Jordans, I buy Vans, Air Max, whatever. And sometimes shoes can end up being in the upper hand of like $150 plus. And
Yeah.
if I can spend that on some shoes that are ultimately going to wear down, I can
Mm-hmm.
surely I can do something more meaningful
Yeah.
with my money. And so the next question as we begin to close, Brandon, is that I want to talk about is this idea of a financial plan. Most people, as you stated, have difficulty with their giving because they don't have their priorities straight when it comes to their money. They don't have this financial plan. They don't have the discipline that's needed. And so when we think about a financial plan, what are some, I guess, a basic savings plan that you recommend maybe for a year, for a month, biweekly, etc., that can be easily implemented into the lives of the listeners?
So, savings plan. First of all, um, what I know I'm guilty of this because I've done this where our savings, we may just have one savings account and we put everything in there. Like, so everything that we're desiring to, whether it be short term, long term, or emergency, we just throw it all together. And I think that does a disservice to you, especially when it comes to planning. Here's the thing about savings is that unless there has to be a vision behind your savings. This is why I preach. I don't necessarily like the term budget
Right.
because it sounds like a diet. And I'm sure you look like you work out. I need to work out a little bit more, but January everybody has a desire to lose weight, right?
Yep.
And everybody's ready to hit the gym, eat right, junk food's gone, right? But then come
Yep.
February, where everybody at,
Yep.
like where, and I'm guilty of that. I know I'm guilty of that. But the thing is, it's because we haven't decided to make it a lifestyle versus
Mm,
just a fad, right? Diets are only supposed to happen for a short period of time. That's
right.
why they're so extreme, right? And you're supposed to not stay on them forever. You're supposed to eventually change your lifestyle, change your eating habits. But oftentimes we'll do a diet, even if we do it for 6 months to a year, we then will go right back to eating what we normally do. And guess what? You're going to gain that weight super
Right
fast.
back. Yep.
So it's gotta your decision making has to be a lifestyle change. It's not about spending less money or saving a whole lot of money. It's about how do I use this money to um or how do I use this money to drive my vision?
Mm,
So I tend to think of not from a budget standpoint, but from a vision spending plan.
mm,
So every single savings account that I own, there's a plan for it. And there's three, I guess if you want to say general ideas when it comes to savings. There's an emergency fund, there's a short-term savings fund, and then there's a long-term savings. An emergency savings is where if something catastrophic were to happen, right? And they recommend 6 months to a year. Now there are some gurus that believe that you should just start off with 1,000. I don't necessarily agree with that because I've experienced having a lot of savings in our account and we lost our job and we had to use it all. And if it wasn't for that savings amount, we wouldn't have had the money to survive. So I know what it's like. $1,000 would not cut it.
Mm-mm.
It would not cut it. So you really have to. I know it sounds crazy. It sounds radical, and it really is. But you have to save 6 months to a year of whatever your monthly expenses are. But you also, within that, if you were ever to lose your job, that's an emergency situation. If you were all of a sudden unexpectedly, your employer just put their finger up in the air, the wind is blowing to the east, you're fired. Like when that actually happens to you, which it happens to a lot of people, you're gonna need that time to find another position. And especially nowadays, man, it's hard, it's difficult to find jobs anymore. It's not like they used to be. So when that happens, you need that cushion, you need that money. If anything, at least a month, at least give yourself a month of expenses. So, but here's the thing about the emergency fund, it's for emergencies, sudden unemployment, replacement of whatever items that you need in order to make income, emergency medical expenses, repairs that if you leave them alone, they will just accumulate more damage. Those are true emergencies. Plannable annual expenses is not an emergency. Vacation and holidays is not an emergency. Home renovations, good deals on consumer goods because you're short on your bills is not an emergency. That just is poor management of your money. So you got to, when you have that emergency fund, that needs to stay an emergency fund. And my recommendation to those listening is, when you do have an emergency fund, make it difficult to get money from. Don't make it so easy. Now, I know that sounds counterproductive because, like, wouldn't you need access right away if an emergency happened? Look, you can use the money that you have, especially if you've been managing your money well, you can use the little bit that you have to maybe cover for a moment while you have either yourself or a loved one go and get the emergency money from maybe a bank or something like that. If you set it up, which is what I recommend, set it up to where you actually have to physically go somewhere in order to get that money. Like, you can't just simply use your debit card or just simply pull it out from any ATM. You got to physically actually go and get the money. And maybe, like, you're looking at me crazy and saying, like, no, that doesn't work. I need instant access. Okay, even if that's true, your long term and short term, you should make it difficult. A lot of us have apps, right, for our banks, and we can transfer money at any given notice. Don't do that to yourself. Don't do that. But if you have no plan behind those savings accounts, short-term savings accounts, by the way, should be set aside for those things that you're wanting, those impulse purchases that we often have. It's those things that you save up for over a short period of time to eventually accumulate. So shoes would be a short-term savings plan, right? Going on a trip would be a short-term savings plan. Long-term would be investing for the long term. So retirement would be one of those areas, which, by the way, I'll just throw this in here. Retirement is one of those things that our generation definitely does not think about when it comes to their financial planning. And so you got to realize, young people, we have to realize that most companies these days are not sticking with man, um, I can't even think of the term right on the top of my head.
That's fine.
Pension plans. Most companies are getting rid of pensions. So you used to just rely on your company basically saving up for your retirement and then eventually paying you a pension plan to the day you die. That is almost becoming non-existent. Now most companies are switching to 401ks, 403bs, to where you have to basically use your money to pay towards your retirement or invest in your retirement. And some companies will match whatever you put into those retirement accounts. Some companies won't. So it's basically starting to become your sole responsibility to save up towards your retirement. So that's another thing that you have to think about when it comes to your savings. And there's recommended ratios of percentages of how much you should. I think most would say at least 10% of your income that you should be saving towards your retirement. But that's something that especially our generation and generations after us really need to consider. Most of us don't think we're going to make it to retirement,
Right.
right? Or or we're going to be working forever, because we're invincible. No, we're not.
No.
I'm sure you've probably heard, and stick around, you'll hear enough of them, but horror stories of retirees that only have a social security and they're barely getting paid, and they're barely surviving. I know of people here in California. You cannot survive on a social security here in California alone. Like, it's hardly impossible. But I know of people who that's exactly what happened to them because they didn't plan towards their retirement.
Sad situation.
Yeah, it is. It is.
So I have a plan for your savings, man. That is the first time I've ever heard it explained that way. And actually, I have something to talk to my wife about tonight. Now, because there's something that I mean, I just totally overlooked it. I never thought about it, and I love the idea of, which of course seems counterintuitive, because you think when I need this, if I have an emergency, I need to be able to access the emergency fund relatively quickly in order to uh, help me in this particular difficult situation. But knowing that you can transfer money easily through the mobile apps that we have, the mobile banking apps, can be tempting to, just, oh man, well, I don't have quite enough for the bills this month because I went out and overconsumed using money I don't have. Now I can just at least take 100, maybe $50
Mhm.
from the savings, and
Right, right.
just I'll put it back, next week. And it seems like next week becomes next week, and then next week become next month, and then before you know it, you actually never return that money that you took away from your savings. So yeah, man, thank you for that practical advice. That's something that I know for sure that I need to work on. And again, I'm going to go ahead and start tonight. I'm going to start tonight implementing that plan because I just never heard it explained that way before. But Brandon, as we I appreciate you so much for being on the podcast, man, and sharing your practical advice and knowledge with us. And I'm hoping that those listening have been edified, have been encouraged to talk about their finances, to take charge when it comes to their finances. Don't allow themselves to succumb to this idea of being a slave to your finances. I mean, you control the way you spend your money. And
Right.
so I think it's time that we take back control over that and don't let our money take control over us. So
Amen.
before we go, man, I wanted to allow space for you to have, if you have any closing remarks, but I definitely wanted to hopefully I'm not overstepping here, but I definitely wanted you to just give us a sort of a sneak peek of the podcast that you're about to start, and tell us a little bit about tell us a little bit about that podcast and your goal, your target audience, and things of that nature.
Well, so yeah, my podcast is actually in tune with a workshop that I just launched last month, the Treasure Workshop. It's let me give the full name, the Treasure Biblical Financial Workshop. And so emphasis on biblical and finance. And I got the idea from, of course, when Jesus talked about lay not your treasures in heaven or on earth where moth and rust, destroy, but lay them in heaven. That's where I got the idea of using the term treasure as the theme of my workshop. And so, hopefully I'll be traveling throughout the United States and helping congregations, begin to have those healthy biblical conversations when it comes to money. But I'm doing this podcast to not just promote the workshop, but then to also give practical wisdom every month. I'm probably going to be doing about 2 shows a month. And I'm going to have different people on both, mostly Christians, coming onto the show that have different expertise when it comes to their finances, and just people who are doing well with their finances, and asking them, what are you doing? How does the Bible affect your decision making? And just answering those type of questions. So I'm hoping to, I'll be launching that the first episode next week.
All right.
in the first week of March. So I'm excited about that. The pilot episode's coming soon, and I'll be starting to be released next Thursday. So I'm really excited about that. But yeah, I mean, so if you're listening to this podcast and you're interested in hearing more about what we're doing with the Treasure Workshop, it's a work that my elders have decided that will be a part of my responsibilities here at the Highland Church of Christ. And so it's not an expensive thing, but we would definitely, I would love to be able to come to your congregation and host the workshop. But if nothing else, listen to the podcast and hopefully you'll get some good edification and just some nuggets of wisdom to, how to deal with finances.
Absolutely. Well, I know for sure if it's dealing with finances, we're going to get wisdom. Finances, again, you can't avoid it. So why not go ahead and learn about them, learn about it, and go ahead and learn how to utilize our finances, save that, and ultimately how to take control over our finances. Man, I hope to have you to come here and do the workshop. It would be an honor to meet you in person and to be able to just go out to lunch, talk, man, and then really just, continue to build on our friendship. I'm so glad to have I have met you through Ron, man. He had a lot to say, a lot of encouraging things to say about you. And you were the first guy that he mentioned when I said, man, I'm needing someone to talk to about finances. Like, I know finances is a major issue. He said, man, Brandon Greene. I said, isn't that the guy that you went, you drove all the way across the country to be in his wedding? He said, yeah, man, that's him. That's him. I said, I definitely reach out to him, man. So I thank you so much for accepting the invitation, for being on the show, and for just giving an outstanding job, man, about finances and sharing your practical knowledge with how we can control our finances. So, is there any closing remarks that you have?
No, I appreciate you. Appreciate what you're doing. I love this podcast, and I look forward to the other talks that you'll be having with other members of the body, and just pushing the idea of taking the theological and making it practical. Like, I
Yes,
love
sir.
that. I love that concept. So hopefully this encourage people to think about it from that perspective. So I appreciate you. Appreciate our new friendship,
Same.
and look forward to other moments of being with you and your family. Appreciate you.
Yes, sir. You take care, Brandon. Thank you.
You too, brother.
What a fantastic job that was done by Brandon. I'm so thankful that he was able and willing to come onto the episode to talk with us about money. Again, there's so much more that we can dive into in the discussion of money, but I pray and hope that the things that were discussed in this episode were beneficial to you. A way that you can let me know that is by leaving a review, telling me exactly what you thought of the episode. Even if that review is a criticism, please tell me how I can get better in producing these episodes and just better as a podcaster overall. Again, I'm so thankful for you guys, and I pray and hope that you have a plan in place now to better deal with your finances and to better move forward and navigate the future as we all strive to implement practical Christianity. Thank you, guys.